Kratos did his best to hide his agony at hearing the screams of his wife. She had been suffering for hours, and his being unable to help made him feel worse. When the birthing woman had suggested he stay and assist her, as was customary for fathers and their newborns in the village, Kratos shook his head and left the room. When outside his house, Kratos stared at his hands. The hands of a killer should not bring life into the world, he thought. After several hours, in which Kratos had paced the perimeter of the house dozens of times, Faye's screaming ceased, and a new sound took its place. A high-pitched wailing was the noise now echoing from inside. Kratos approached the doorway and took a deep breath. He pushed the door open as gently as he could. Faye sat up in their wooden bed, which filled a whole quarter of the small hut. Her face shone with sweat and she looked exhausted, but she beamed at Kratos as he entered. He stood awkwardly at the end of the bed, unsure how to proceed. "Come meet our son, my love," Faye said. Kratos hesitated. Was it safe for him to be around their son? But his wife beckoned him with her slender hand and he obliged, taking careful steps towards her. He placed one hand on Faye's shoulder and stretched out the other towards the baby. His arm shook slightly as he ran his rough fingers over the child's skin. The baby settled as he flicked his large eyes between his father and mother. "He is healthy?" Kratos asked. The birthing woman cleared her throat. "He is small and pale, but I am sure that will pass." She talked to Kratos' feet. None of the villagers liked to meet his eyes. Have you decided on a name?" "Yes," said Faye, at the same time that Kratos said no. They looked at each other. "He should have a king's name," said Kratos. "But what's wrong with Loki, my love?" said Faye. "I cannot explain it. The sound gives me a bad feeling." Faye sighed and smiled softly at her husband. "Very well, then he shall be Atreus, as you suggested. Does that please you, dearest?" Kratos wiped his love-soaking hair away from her face and kissed her forehead as a reply. He knelt down and enveloped his wife and son in his arms. Faye stared at Atreus. "He will grow up to be strong, like his father." Kratos growled, "I hope he will grow up to be good, like his mother." The peaceful baby suddenly let out a shrill cry. Faye giggled. "So it begins," she said. At the edge of the village, hidden among the pine trees and berry bushes, a group of men and women crouched and listened. They were covered from head to toe in dirt, paint, and streaks of blood. As the sounds of the newborn reached them, several hissed. The largest of the women, sat closest to the village edge, held up her hand and the hissing ceased. "The godchild is born," said the wild woman. "We attack at nightfall." A dozen hushed growls of agreement reached her ears. She signalled for them to back away, and as one the group crept into the depths of the forest. The wild woman, their leader, remained behind for several seconds. She could barely hold in her excitement at the thought of what was to come. She would consume the flesh of the godchild and absorb its powers. Then she would be the most powerful berserker the world had ever known. Faye was soundly asleep, with the animal skin blanket twisted around her body. Kratos lay next to her, doing his utmost to remain quiet lest his bulk wake her or the boy. Every few minutes, however, he could not resist raising his head and checking that the baby was still resting in his cot. His eyes would then dart to the window, the door, then back to the baby before he laid his head onto the pillow once again. After numerous cycles of this, he satisfied himself that all was well. They were safe here. He took one last look at his wife, then closed his eyes and drifted to sleep. Seemingly moments later, he was woken by crashes and flashes. He sat up and was temporarily blinded by bright lights piercing the gaps below and beside the door. Screams and whooping sounds erupted from every direction. Faye awoke and met Kratos' eyes. She leapt from the bed and grabbed her axe, which always lay close to her. "No," said Kratos, strapping on his shield gauntlet. "Protect the boy. I will go." Faye nodded. She picked up the baby and lowered him down onto their bed as Kratos pulled the door open and leapt outside. The village had erupted into chaos. Several homes were on fire, their occupants darting out and running to the safety of the river at the village edge. Many men and women were locked into skirmishes with painted warriors, who were cutting through the unprepared villagers with ease. Kratos roared and dove at the nearest painted man. He battered away the man's axe and grabbed him by the throat. The man's eyes bulged as Kratos slammed him to the ground, then lifted him into the air and threw him as hard as he could. The man flew so far into the sky he disappeared into the night. A crashing sound echoed through the forest several seconds later. Kratos wasted no time and ran to the next enemy, a woman with wild eyes and long, matted hair. Her face appeared to be smeared with blood, and she screamed as she flung her axe at Kratos' head. He ducked and smashed his fist into the woman's chest. Her body crumpled and she fell, dead before she hit the ground. Word had spread among the attackers that the God-Man was out of his house, so they began to back away, throwing spears and axes as they repositioned themselves between the village and the forest. As Kratos followed after them, dozens more sprung from either side, encircling him. As one, the 50 or so warriors rushed him from all sides. He threw his fists, feet and shield into the path of their oncoming bodies, crippling them with single shots, but they continued to attack. Their wild cries and wilder swings took him off guard. They had no apparent concern for their safety. Their only focus was to attack, and sheer numbers meant that some broke through his guard, and sword and axe blades pierced his skin. God that he was, the cuts were minor inconveniences, but as they added up, they sapped at his strength. With a collective cry, 10 of the enemies threw themselves onto Kratos, scratching and swiping at every part of him they could reach as they dragged him to his knees. Kratos grew still. For a moment, the painted people thought they had subdued him. Then he roared and unleashed his Spartan rage, handed down to him through his blood by his father, the god of gods. His limbs exploded outwards, sending all around him sprawling into the darkness. As they again drew in to attack, he crushed their faces with his bare hands, ripping off limbs and heads as if he were tearing paper. From the other side of the village, a familiar yell reached his ears. He turned, doing his best to calm the rage and focus. His eyes slowly faded from red back to green. "Faye," he said. He sprinted back to his house, knocking aside attackers as he went. He kicked open his door and took in the scene within a second. Faye was locked into combat with 5 of the painted people. As Kratos joined the fight, she ripped her axe through the body of one of the men, severing him in 2. Kratos ran up behind another and snapped his neck, then threw the limp body aside. More enemies poured in through the door and window, surrounding the husband and wife, but despite their numbers, they were no match for Kratos and Faye. As they fought, the couple did not realise that one of the painted ones slipped through the window silently and headed not for them, but for the bed. The painted one reached for the crying child just as Faye spotted them. Faye screamed and launched her axe at the painted one's head. Just in time, the painted one leaned back, leaving the axe to plunge into the wall. The painted one turned to Faye and bared her teeth, her braided hair flicking across her face. Faye threw herself at the woman while Kratos dispatched the rest of the warriors in his house. Faye shoved the warrior woman into the wall, sending both of them crashing through the wood. Kratos followed as the 2 women rolled away from each other, then clashed again as they attacked and blocked each other's blows. The battle strayed further and further from the house, and Kratos looked between the baby and his wife. He growled and stood his ground by the bed. He could only help from a distance. Wrapping his hand around the handle of Faye's axe, he wrenched it from the wall and threw it into the air towards his wife. "Faye," he cried. She looked over and saw the axe soaring towards her. She caught it and swung it at the wild woman, slicing through her stomach. The woman backed away and grasped her torso, but her expression of shock morphed into a mad grin. As Faye watched, the wound slowly began to heal. The wild woman let out a screech, turned and ran into the trees. The surviving painted warriors followed until the village was left silent, save for the crackling of flames and the sobs of mothers.